Right, kia ora koutou, ko Victoria McLennan tōku ingoa. Welcome to this wonderful Tech Week webinar brought to you by IT professionals on the subject of lifting cyber capability for Aotearoa. If you have not been to one of our webinars before, how we operate this is basically the panel has a nice chat. We ask some questions of each other and give you a good overview of the topic, and then we open it up to the floor for questions and answers. Now, you're able to ask us questions at any time using the Q&A function, so please just type your questions in. We probably won't answer those in real time. We'll probably batch them up, and after I've gone through asking a few kind of discovery or exploratory questions of our fabulous panel, we'll go through the questions that you've asked, and I'll facilitate asking them on your behalf. So fire your questions away. We have a lovely person who's collecting those in the background. So if you missed my introduction at the beginning, kia ora koutou, ko Victoria McLennan, but please call me Vic. And I am the CEO of IT Professionals. I've been in this role this is my 9th week, not very long now. And this is the first webinar of a series that we're going to be running for the rest of the year. I'm really interested in any suggestions on topics or speakers that people would like to hear from. We are recording this session, so you will be able to go back to it later and get some wonderful gems from our panelists. If you hear something that they've said in particular that you'd like to hear about a bit more about. And if you have any questions of us at ITP, please email anytime info@itp.nz. So without further ado, let's kick this off and talk about lifting the cybersecurity of Aotearoa. I'm just going to ask each of my fabulous panelists, Bryce, Doug and Izzy, to briefly introduce themselves, tell us who they are and what they do. We'll start with you, Izzy.
Kia ora, Vic. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko taranaki te maunga, ko wata te awa, ko Aotea te waka, ko ngā te mutunga o wharekauri te iwi, ko Izzy tōku ingoa. So my name's Izzy. I am an independent security communications specialist, which is not something you see around very often. So to describe that, I'm a communications professional by training. I have spent about 15 years working in communications and PR. And for the last 6 of those, I've been working specifically in cybersecurity. So I've had a reasonably non-traditional entry into cybersecurity. Please don't ask me about networking or any widgets. I'm not the girl for that job. But I was part of the CERT New Zealand establishment team, so set up CERT NZ, particularly around their communications and media approach. So that's really my interest, is how we communicate about security, how we tell security stories, and how we bring everyday people on that journey with us. Because security is everything and everything is security. And so we've got to find a way to make that really relevant for everyday New Zealanders in their everyday lives. And so this is something that I love talking about it here today, and I'll be talking about it more at KawaiCon in July, if any of you will be attending that. So that's me talking about cybersecurity.
It's great to have you here, and it's great to have someone who's come from a different background. I've been doing these Tech Week events all week, and the topic of cybersecurity comes up a lot, and there is an expectation that it's scary people in a back room. So it's great to have you be able to do that translation, Izzy. Thank you. Next, I'll hand it to Doug, who appears to be sitting on a beach somewhere tropical right now. If you could introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Doug Nedick. I'm a principal consultant with Azenic, which is an independent cybersecurity consultancy based largely in Wellington. I've been working in IT for well over 20 years, kind of a few too many to want to count these days. I got into security about 10 years ago when I started working with some of the people from Azenic originally as a customer. And I did work with the New Zealand Government Cloud Program I helped write the infamous 105 questionnaire that that many people might have come to hate. Yeah, I recently, a couple of years ago, moved back from New Caledonia, which is what's behind me, to New Zealand, and decided to kind of work in security full-time as a consultant. That's my story.
Fabulous. I've always blamed Chris for the 105 questions. Now I know I can add you to the list of names to blame. So thanks for that introduction. Now, Bryce, I know you come to us from the regional New Zealand. So tell us a bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, I'm a senior cybersecurity engineer within the Security Operations Centre, the SOC, at Advantage. Advantage runs a SOC and IT team and a data centre down here in Palmerston North. They've been deeply involved in technology since 1984, so they're very mature with their output there. I'm very happy to be a part of the team here. I've completed a PhD in security and risk analysis of cyber-physical systems, IoT, based on NIST 853 framework. So I've been delivering papers and information at Auckland University and Auckland University of Technology for quite a few years. I've done a Masters of Information Security and Digital Forensics and also an MBA. So I perform quite a cool role here of documentation, working with external clients, evaluating their security risk posture, and offering mitigation strategies for them. We're right at the coalface here. We're part of the GCSB, NCSC malware-free networks, so we have threat intelligence feeds and so forth. So we're right at that bleeding edge of information.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so for everyone who's listening to and watching this webinar, you can hear the credentials of the panel. Fantastic people to have here. They responded really quickly when I put a call out to who would like to join a panel during Tech Week, and I really, really appreciate that all of you have given up your time to come and talk to this audience. Now, I asked each of our panelists to prepare their thoughts on this really broad topic that I've posed to them. So to give us a brief overview from their perspective on the topic of lifting the cyber capability of Aotearoa. So we'll go back to you first, Doug, and can you just give us a bit of an overview of what this all means to you?
Sure. So I think probably everyone's aware of kind of the desperate undersupply of cybersecurity professionals internationally. I mean, you hear numbers bandied around like there's 3 million more jobs in the US than there are people, and I don't know whether that's true, but those stories are indicative of just how few people there are, and at the same time this kind of rising tide of cybercrime. I mean, everyone has heard about all the ransomware stories, and so we need to do better and more and work smarter in the space. I don't think it's just though a supply of professionals problem. I think it's actually something that everyone in New Zealand's got to get better at. I think it's something that in particular IT professionals need to do a better job at. But it kind of starts for me at board and leadership team level. Those people working on, and I'm on board myself, need to know more, understand more about cybersecurity, can kind of do a better job of managing and leading.
And I did the old thing of being on mute and started to speak. Yeah, I totally agree with you. This has got to be tackled at all levels. So that's a great way of setting the scene. So Bryce, do you want to follow on from that, and from your perspective, what is this topic about?
Okay. in my few very brief notes, I've put down, basically what we're determining is how do we implement a cybersecurity transformation in New Zealand? It needs to be across the board, organisational, educational, and basically a mindset change. So there is cybersecurity transformation happening within organisations, albeit fairly slowly. It's put as a security rather than a full business application where it has to happen from the top down and the bottom up. It is our staff that are at the true coalface. So really, the way I see it is perhaps looking at establishing a culture of resilience at all levels within New Zealand, and that's no easy task. So looking at things like trust gaps, learning how to identify what a risk is in terms of cyber, where we get educated at a very, very early age to look both ways on the road before crossing it, to where very few of us would actually take a step out without that in mind. And I think it needs to be at that level. So it's where, and Izzy will completely be aligned with this, it begins with communication. That leads to education, and then perhaps implementation can begin to happen. All nice words, but it's difficult to do. So things within corporates, implementing plans, protocols, policies, all those horrible words that they really hate that Doug will be laughing about. But documentation is the key. So when companies haven't performed any risk analyses and they haven't got a formal review process, they haven't got any documentation, they haven't got an instant response plan. A lot of them don't have business continuity and disaster recovery plans. This is something we need to raise awareness and bring in. And things we're briefly touched on, and we'll touch on them again with the skills shortages. I think maybe looking at having more industry involvement with that, where we look at something like maybe the US internship model, where instead of a job seeker type allowance that, and it used to happen this way, the government will pay 50% of a wage for a certain amount of time, where upskilling happens, where perhaps people have some technical qualifications but no real on-the-job experience. Things like that could certainly help. And as Doug was saying, there's many resources out there to do it. Preset tasks, the SIS. We're looking at MITRE, there's the New Zealand and Australia information security manuals and so forth. There's lots of upskilling that can be done if you're out there and want to get into the industry. There's a lot of things simply on YouTube if you look at it. There's some really good resources available out there.
Great, and I loved your early point about lifting not only capability but the resilience of all of New Zealand, and the ability to respond. Izzy, so with your education and communications hat on, tell us a bit about, from your perspective, what this broad topic means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a few components to it, right? If this was easy, we would have solved it already. And so I think that's, people often will be like, oh, well, I've got the solution. Actually, the solution has to be so multidimensional, so multifaceted, because the technology that we operate within all the time is moving so rapidly, and often with security as an afterthought. So that's kind of one thing that really comes to mind for me, particularly when speaking to an audience of practitioners, is we all need to be thinking about security right from the beginning. It's got to be baked in by design, rather than something that we go, oh gosh, we should probably sort that out right at the very end. So that's one big thing for me. But then thinking about everyday New Zealanders, this is a huge challenge for them. And the thing that I liken it to is how we respond to something like an earthquake to how we responded to COVID. So when there's an earthquake, we know what it is, right? We know that if it starts shaking, you get down, you get under cover, we've got an emergency kit, we've got emergency water. When COVID hit, everyone was like, what do you mean a pandemic? What are we what do we do? You know, the need for guidance and for help is so much stronger because people weren't upskilled in it. And that's what I think about with cybersecurity a lot of the time, is that we simply haven't, as an industry and also as government, haven't necessarily put the emphasis on building that upskilling for everyone as part of their everyday lives, because these are things that just happen to you every day. And I also think that as security practitioners, particularly inside the broader IT landscape, there's also a really big role to play of breaking down barriers, of bringing more people into our world, of, you know, there can definitely be a little bit of elitism in security. And so actually it's not all, you know, hoodies and the matrix in the background, that actually it's just normal people trying to make things safer. And sure, like there is plenty of hoodies, don't get me wrong. But, you know, it's all about kind of making it human, because without people, we wouldn't need the technology. So I think really recentering people back into that security conversation is what's really critical for me in that uplift.
I loved your analogy around preparedness, and how if we who live in Wellington experience an earthquake, we know what to do. Everyone in Aotearoa, Christchurch probably knows, but there are other parts of the country who don't experience them and yeah, don't live and breathe it. So I love that. How do we bake this into everyday lives? Thank you all for your fabulous introductions. I've got a few questions to run through, and I just haven't thanked the wonderful people who are listening to this as well for giving up your time. Please, I see someone's already kicked off asking questions on the Q&A. Please fire your questions through as they come to mind, and we will get to them probably in about 20 minutes time, and we'll aim to be wrapping this up just before 5 p.m, which I should have said in the intro. So expanding on your introductions, and Doug, you particularly did allude to, we all know there's different types of attacks, but let's talk a little bit about the bad actors who are behind those attacks and how they're seeming to become more increasingly sophisticated and well-resourced. So can you just expand a little bit, and for anyone who's listening to this who doesn't really understand how extensive the network of people on the attacking side are, give us a bit of insight into that space.
Sure. Look, I think, I mean, there's a huge range of bad actors out there, but what I think is kind of the key thing behind there's this sort of this huge kind of uptick in kind of stories and attacks. You know, there was that period a couple of years ago when there was a kind of ransomware of New Zealand organisations every couple of weeks. What's behind that is organised crime with an emphasis on the organised, and what they're doing is, the change here is not a technological one, but it's about business model innovation. The bad actors are innovating their business models like crazy, and they're taking lessons from management, traditional management techniques. So we find them outsourcing, we find them specializing. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting, just come out of a couple of recent attacks on Microsoft by a group called Lapsus, was they didn't bother breaking into organizations. They just went and bought access to organizations off other criminals called initial access brokers. And all they do is find their way into your organization, find out roughly how much money how good an access they can get, and then they sell that on to someone who monetizes it. You've got a whole heap of other organized criminal gangs who provide as-a-service platforms with customer SLAs, with help desks who answer your phone 24/7. That business model innovation is driving, in my view, a large amount of what we're seeing. It's not changes in technology, it's the way that they're improving their organization. And that's, specifically in the case of ransomware, we know that's exactly what's happening, but it's happening in a lot of other cases as well.
Wow. Just expanding on that, Izzy, thinking about it from that education and communication with everyday New Zealanders context, do you have a simple set of messages that you've used or could draw on for those of us who aren't very good at describing that the bad actors' other side of the coin to everyday New Zealanders?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so one of the main things that I focused on when building that media approach for SUDNZ, because there does need to be people out there talking about this, because if there's not, you either get Bruce from the computer shop down the road, who I'm sure is a lovely person, but maybe doesn't know quite the detail, or you've got someone trying to sell something, talking about it. So there does need to be people who can act in an independent manner out talking about these things. But one of the things that was really critical for me was what information can people do something with? And so while the who is really interesting to us, and I think that's something as interested people we should dig into, it's more about the why. It's more about, why. Quite often people would say, well, why would anyone attack me? I don't have anything to hide. It's fine. And actually, it's less about you and more about opportunity. It's more about, can I get in, particularly as an individual, can I, as a criminal, find a way to monetize your identity, your data for these criminal gangs? But I think, so often I've been asked, who's behind this attack or that attack? And is it the Russians? People love asking if it's Russians. And actually, I would always try and drive it back to finding out who did it isn't going to solve the problem. So let's talk about what we can do to prevent this from happening in the future and how we can recover, to make sure that we're back in business tomorrow.
That's great advice. Right, Bryce, you live and breathe this stuff. You're beaming your way to us from inside a SOC. Tell us a bit about what it is that we're protecting, who it is we're protecting ourselves from.
Okay, I think Doug was exactly right. There are vast amounts of money out there. SciSci.Mag put out some information that in 2021, US reported a loss of $6 trillion. That's 6,000 billion dollars, which is 6,000 million dollars. That's a lot of money. So we're no longer looking at individuals. Normally, it's not script kiddies, but sophisticated networks of well-resourced teams. Most military organizations on the planet now have a cybersecurity division, and they have within them very, very smart people. So the organisations behind cyber threats are normally well-resourced. It can be sponsored by a nation state. They run rigorous, multi-layered and essentially long-term campaigns. The issue can be that there can be a thing called an advanced persistent threat within your system that you won't know about, that's still sitting there just having a look and finding stuff. So exactly what Doug was looking for, talking about, a cybercrime cartel might target your network, sell access keys to another organisation that's specialised in penetration. So it's no longer the old smash and grab approach. So whilst these attackers may operate well below the security radar and for years, they're not really just looking for credit card data or looking to deface your website. They're looking for whatever has value, whatever makes our New Zealand businesses competitive as an organisation in particular. So they're looking for research and development information, customer data, intellectual property, even marketing strategies, which I think Doug was touching on. So this is where we need to, or we're looking at threat intelligence feeds, we're looking at lateral movement, we need to be aware of what's going on, and that takes a level of effort, I think, on our part. So we're no longer just looking at, what would you call it, opportunists. It's well-directed, well-funded, and well-targeted. They will target specific industries or specific businesses that they see that they can get some research and development information from, for example.
Yeah, you've all painted this really petrifying scene, right? That we all need to really prepare for, like we need to prepare our earthquake kits, and so I'll just carry on with that for a moment, and we'll carry on with you, Bryce. You mentioned that many organisations now have cyber capability inside their organisations, but we do seem to have a deficit of capability at board level.
Yeah.
So let's start at the top of organisations, at the governance level. And I feel like there's a cognitive dissonance here where many boards know that cyber exists and it's a threat, but if it hasn't happened to their company yet, they're not actively managing it. Absolutely. How do we redress that? What should we be doing differently?
Well, there's some good things and some bad things. We'll maybe touch upon the privacy bill and the enactment of that as we put in. It's just over a year old. Until the cost of non-compliance outweighs the cost of compliance, people will not comply. That's simple business logic. The issue is, I actually like the way that we're approaching it at the moment. We're not slapping people with huge fines. We're educating, upskilling. We're looking at what the root cause is. We're going, hey, look, maybe you should have done it this way, and then sharing the information. That is key. I think our knowledge, information sharing, our threat intelligence is really, really important. Instead of going, oh God, we had this legacy machine that was running and we forgot about it. We had a whole set of legacy machines that were kludged together. Everything was working. However, everybody had administrative permissions to be able to do it. We need to share that information instead of people feeling ashamed about it, going, yes, our bad, we've sorted that out now. This is how we did it, and sharing that with everybody out there. So there's also, it isn't just a security department's, what would you call it, premise. It's actually across the whole business organisation. As he was saying, and I totally agree, that security is not something you just bolt on. It's something that has to be established right from the beginning. If we look at Stuxnet, which is one of my favourite things to look at, where the Iranian centrifuges were mucked with and caused all sorts of issues, it's looking like that was caused by somebody, the CIA and Mossad, dropping a USB key every now and again outside the building. And somebody eventually went and plugged it in. Yeah, exactly.
Mind blowing, isn't it?
It is. And so things like that, it's awareness, and it's not just from the top down, it's from the bottom up. Our cleaner, who has got nothing officially to do with security, but if they see somebody wandering around without a badge that they don't recognise, going to somebody and saying, who's that? And they go, oh God, we don't know. And here you go, here's your free chocolate fish you got to, or your morning tea bought for you because you actually brought something up. It's a culture thing.
It's that real mindset shift. Yeah, great. Good to hear. I'm not going to let go of this governance thing for a moment yet, though. Doug, you brought it. I just want to go to Doug because you brought it up in your intro and said you're on a board. Everything Bryce has said, that what we're doing in New Zealand is good and starting to get momentum, but how do we really get boards to sit up and take notice?
So I think for me, so I mentioned I was in New Caledonia not that long ago, and tell you, in New Caledonia, they do not care very much about health and safety. And the question for me, why is it such a big deal in New Zealand? And why do boards care so much about health and safety? And it's because the government's legislated to make it an accountability of boards. And if you look at some of the legislation that's been proposed in Australia, they're talking about doing exactly the same thing there for cybersecurity. And I think if that kind of legislation comes in, boards will definitely sit up and take notice. You have other jurisdictions doing things in the US. You have to include in your SEC filings whether or not you've got cybersecurity risks and what they are and what they look like. And you've got some other things that have been proposed, such as kind of mandatory reporting for ransomware or other serious incidents. Those kinds of activities, those kinds of legislations and regulations make the people at the top have to take notice and have to provide leadership. And I think, unfortunately, with New Zealand, unless we do something like that, we won't get what we need from senior management and from boards.
It sounds like you've been a fly on the wall in my CSAC meetings for the last 8 months, because this is exactly what we talk about, the carrot or the stick. How do we really affect this change? For anyone on here who doesn't know, CSAC is the Cybersecurity Advisory Committee advising Ministers Little and Clark. And I don't tell many people that I'm involved in that, but now we know 91 other people know. And this is exactly what we've been talking about. Is it a legislative hammer that we need to be affecting, or are there some carrots to cause some encouragement? And how do we get those balances and levers right? And so next I was going to move to you, Izzy, to talk about education, but you've been nodding your head madly. So I wonder if you just want to add anything to this little discussion about at the governance level before we start talking about education.
I reckon I can even segue it. I reckon I can do it.
Excellent. Do that.
Because schools in New Zealand are all independent entities. So they all have boards as well. You know, they are all governed by their boards. And school boards, you know, they have a pretty rough time of it, right? They give up their time for free to do this work. And they are responsible for a lot. So things like health and safety, they're responsible for. And, you know, we've got about 2,500 schools in New Zealand, public schools in New Zealand, each of which is governed by a board. And some of those will have access to board members who have knowledge of things like IT, of cybersecurity. And then there will have some who are scrambling around to get anyone to sit on the board, you know, and we might have to bribe them with a morning tea, actually, you know. So thinking about how we can lift that capability is also, boards aren't only for large enterprise, boards are for all sorts of different areas. And so lifting board capability is definitely about the big fish, you know, but they've also got more resources. So what can we as professionals do to mobilize those smaller boards in our communities? And so one of the things when I think about schools, so for context, I'm working alongside the Ministry of Education currently in their cybersecurity in schools program to try and lift the cyber capability of our schools, you know, or to make that available to them. As I said before, they're independent, so they can make that decision for them for what's best for their school community. But one of the things we can actually do as practitioners is put our hand up to be on those school boards. You know, now that's a pretty tough ask, but actually if we're the people in the back row going, gosh, I wish schools would do more about IT security, anyway, go and have a nice lunch now. You know, that's actually, we've got to lean into some of these problems as well to make sure that we're really advocating, we're really eating our own dog food when it comes to making these decisions. And so there is work going on at a ministry level. But I think that schools are such a core part of our communities that it's also about us thinking about how we can offer our services in that interim period where, you know, ministries can't just turn stuff around on a dime. I wish we could. But we can, as practitioners, go, well, how can we support? And how can we, even if it's in conversation, you know, when people are saying, gosh, you know, schools just need to know better, actually even being a dissenting voice that says, actually, this is really hard and they've just come through 2 years of pandemic, maybe we can be a bit kinder to them too.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I really feel for our teachers. So Doug, are you going to be rushing off and putting your hand up to be on the school board?
I'm already on a charity board,
right.
so my plea would be not for schools, but for charities, because small charities possibly in a worse situation than schools because they're not supported by ministries. But I mean, the point is a general one, right? Volunteer, be on a board for a charity, be on a board for a school, and lend them some help because mostly they all need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for that. And Izzy, great segue. I really liked it. That was excellent. So we've talked about businesses, we've talked about governance, we've talked about schools. We haven't talked about my mother, who's age 70 and uses all sorts of features on her iPhone that I haven't even discovered, to be fair, or my 11-year-old niece, who sends me fabulous social media messages on a very regular basis. How do we lift the capability of just the general public, of people who aren't in the system of a business, who's focused on something? Bryce, what are your thoughts there on how do we lift that broader capability?
I think this is probably Izzy's domain here, education. It begins at the early ages. It's a very rare 5-year-old that isn't able to use a touch device of some sort. You know, that it doesn't know what the interweb is and able to log on and do things. If we look at the Socratic way of reasoning, you don't ask a question without already knowing what and identified what the answer is. The answer is the 11-year-old gets upskilled and then educates the 70-year-old. Most 70-year-olds are quite happy to have their 11-year-old show them what to do, but wouldn't like it if I turned up and said, hey, this is what you need to do. So education needs to start right at the beginning, and we have some incredibly smart people in New Zealand. Most of our kids are incredibly smart. We need to what would you call that, corral that knowledge and actually utilize it, because they are our future security. You know, I'm not, I'm the current security, you know. Yeah. So, yeah.
I love that. Get the young people to teach the older. Yeah. Now, Izzy, before I come to you to give us the definitive answer, Doug, you've got a teenager. How are you educating your teenager? I'm sure in your household there's these conversations go on all the time, to be protecting himself.
So in my household, my son has MFA on all of his accounts.
Of course, he
not
is.
Surprising. Greater challenge with my partner than with him, unfortunately. But yeah, look, I think there's a couple of different things. One, I think that security professionals need to become better communicators in general. I spend a lot of time logging for Ozenic, and the audience I'm aiming at is not security professionals. It's our clients who are often the reason they hire us is because they don't have security expertise themselves. But in general, I think we're in an industry that suffers from way too much jargon. We're an industry that suffers from a kind of desire to kind of keep the knowledge and therefore keep the power. And we also are guilty of spreading too much FUD, way too much, especially fear, way too much fear. And then people, when they get too scared, they just switch off. There's nothing I can do. I'm not going to do anything. So I think as an industry, we need to work on that, on doing a much better job of talking to people in plain English, in terms of understand about things that they care about. You know, so I have managed to get my mother to put MFA on all of her social media accounts. And that was by
I'm impressed.
Yeah, and my 73-year-old mother, and that's and yeah, I should have outsourced that to my son, but I didn't. But you know, that was by talking about what she cared about and explaining to her and saying, look, it's easy, and you really don't want these kind of things to happen, and ways that she can understand and things that matter to her. We need to get better at doing that and do it without kind of playing too much of the fear card.
Excellent. Good to know that you've got, and your family's effect will ripple out to wider whānau, of course. So Izzy, this is what you live and breathe. How do we really get through to multi-generations to explain these difficult concepts?
Yeah, and it's hard, you know, like I think that that's kind of the really big thing is it's hard. It's not going to be one ad campaign or one interaction that's going to make this huge shift for people. So I think thinking about it as an incremental shift is a really important thing. You know, the perfect is the enemy of the done. And I think that as practitioners, gosh, we love a bit of perfection, you know, so we, you know, speaking to Doug's point about FUD, you know, I've been party to more conversations than I can count about the perils of SMS two-factor authentication. And actually that's fine for a group of security practitioners around the table at the pub, but not the conversation I would have with my mother, because actually some is better than none. And actually we need to really be thinking about this as a journey rather than as a destination. You know, perfect security doesn't exist. And so how can we get people on that journey? How can we make it real for them in a way that they feel like I've done something, and actually it feels like I've made a difference. I feel like I can be more secure now, because actually, changing that one password, that was pretty easy. And setting up MFA, that was pretty easy. But actually, if we go, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, I'd feel overwhelmed. You know, I came into this industry 6 years ago. I had no knowledge of security pretty much whatsoever. And I was really fortunate to be surrounded by people who wanted to bring me on that journey, who wanted to take the time and explain it to me. And so I've gone through this evolution myself. I know that it's possible. Unfortunately, we can't just put every New Zealander into a desk sitting in the cert for 6 months each, because that's certainly what helped me. But I think that, you know, as people who carry this knowledge, it's our obligation to share it and to do it in a meaningful way, and to make sure that we are communicating in a way that makes sense for people, you know, connecting with them as individuals. We're using analogies, we are connecting it to the things that they care about, because it's that humanity that makes us important. It's those connections that are so critical. So we should leverage those when we're having these security conversations as well.
So I love that one step at a time. It's almost like we need a national campaign to, and you're going to probably tell me the cert's already done this, but anyway, a national campaign to get everyone to stop reusing the same password, for example. So just start with that one small step. Stop using the same password for every single thing that you log into is a great first step, right?
Yeah. And look, I would have loved to have run that campaign in my days at CERT, so you never know, maybe they've still got it in the backlog.
A lovely MFA campaign running at the moment, which is great.
Yeah, great. Good to know. But first we need people to stop using the same passwords, and my experience from talking about some of these people. Now, I'm just going to start. I was going to throw a question to you, one last question to you, but actually one of the audience members has asked something really similar to my last question. So Lawrence has asked us, we're all well aware of the large deficit in cybersecurity professionals in New Zealand and globally. And he'd like to know what the panel perceive are the largest challenges in attracting more talent into the cybersecurity industry and how that can be resolved. And as you know from our prep discussion, I asked you all the question to also give the audience some tips on if they did want to get started on becoming a cybersecurity professional, where they should get started. So I'll go to you first, Bryce. We all acknowledge that there's this deficit, but what are the challenges to attracting people into our industry? And if they want to get into it, how should they get started?
That's a very expansive question.
Deliberately.
Deliberately, yes. It's a lot of work. Okay, it's not something where you don't spend 8 hard hours working on it. It's not something where you're not on call. You are on call. You will swap that about. You'll work weekends. You'll work hard and long if there is an incident that needs to be taken care of. And we have all our clients' concerns become our concerns, and their penchant for not doing things becomes our problem when something comes up. So it's a very difficult thing. I have spent 9 years at academia getting up to this level of knowledge and understanding, and it's a multifaceted level. It's not cheap. If anybody has actually sat which we all have, proper certification, industry certification, it's pretty expensive. However, there are other ways that we can do it. And I think the New Zealand number 8 fencing wire thing is pretty cool, where we'll all answer questions. I remember going a long time ago, one of my first Microsoft certificates I did, and during the actual course, they said, oh, when people ask you about this knowledge, to share this knowledge, you don't share it because it's really expensive. You're paying this amount of money to be here, so don't share it. They need to come on the course. And that was, and I'm talking like, early 90s, that just going, oh my God, this is not right. And then moving along, when I did I did actually a certified Novell engineer many, many years ago, and it was the same thing, and it was this American way of knowledge. I don't think we have this. I think that we are quite comfortable with sharing our knowledge. We know that information shared is actually doubled, it's not halved. And so I think with people wanting to break in to the industry, ask people, find somebody, send them an email. They're not going to tell you to leave, and to naff off. They might say, hey, look, I'm really busy, I'll get back to you. But people will do that. We have a strong culture of mentoring here in New Zealand, where we would be quite happy to bring people on and bring them up and move them, because I know personally, speaking personally, it makes me feel good with that. And especially when I can direct people to cheap, if not free, resources. The stuff on YouTube is fantastic. With the CISSP, there's, I think, under 500 people in New Zealand with a CISSP. The online free things on YouTube, just look at it. I can't remember the person who does it, but I've gone through a lot of them, are fantastic. They are really good. I'm going through that myself, and there's no need to spend $10,000, $20,000 on going to the courses. The exam is what, $800 to $1,000. That's expensive enough. So I think one of the things that we could do is start putting these teams of people together to share our knowledge, to bring us up, where I think Doug was saying, and I've looked at that figure, and it is actually on the American government website, that they're looking for between 3 and 6 million IT cyber people at the moment. So we can supply people for that. The only really thing that we can entice people with is it pays well. Obviously, because it's security. It's hard to do, and most of us are quite happy doing hard things, because they are hard things. And there is the level of kudos that's there as well, which is permeating. We're the modern witch doctors of the society. Also a bastion of defence and freedom. So I think there's a lot of resources where young people are perhaps scared to approach us.
Thanks,
what's
Bryce.
the worst that could happen? Yeah.
And it's really, really good to know that people in the industry are really approachable. You weren't selling it at the beginning, though. You were reminding me of my early career as a DBA and Unix admin, where I was on call 24/7.
Yes.
And it was hell, and I wouldn't recommend that to anyone. So there is that.
Everything has its pluses and minuses.
Well, this is true.
It takes dedication.
Yeah. So, Izzy, I'll go to you next. Bryce has just described many of the barriers to entry to this industry. If you were out there wanting to get started, or what advice would you give people who do want to get started in this industry?
Yeah, so I think I've got advice for people who want to get started, but I've also got some challenges to some organizations as well. So my advice, I am a media person at my very core. And actually there is some really great media out there that is really easy to consume and really easy to get your hands on that is great information. So podcasts, there's some fantastic podcasts out there. Risky Business is probably the best one that there is. But if you're into more of a kind of true crime bent, Darknet Diaries is like a true crime podcast crossed with cybersecurity. Twitter is a hellscape, but also has tons of great security people sharing heaps of information. So if you can tune yourself a good Twitter feed, you'll get some really good information in there. And the thing that people seem to be doing right now is Substack, these newsletters and, kind of the future of blogging. So Risky Biz have got a newsletter and a blog on Substack. Kim Zeta, who wrote the kind of definitive book on Stuxnet, she's got a great newsletter called 0 Day on Substack as well, which she puts out for free. And also go and talk to people at cons and at meetups. So head down to KawaiCon if you've got a ticket, go to your local iSig meetup. If you're in Wellington, there's First Tuesdays, there's Project Wednesday. There's lots of meetups all over the country where you can go and have a beer and talk to people about the thing that they really love, the thing they really care about. And my challenge to organizations is kind of twofold. It's, do you need a senior or can you grow your own? Because I think that
after my own heart here,
that we need more junior roles. We need people. We need an opportunity to grow people, or this lack of senior people won't be resolved. And similarly, multidisciplinary teams. So people from different backgrounds, people like me who have come from a different trade, have got all of these skills to contribute, just because they haven't got it come through a traditional pathway. I think that contribution is really critical.
Great. Yeah, totally. Reinforce everything you just said. Now, Doug, Sheridan's has asked some great questions actually, but one question around, is the pathway, do you need to get a BSc? Does it need to be a formal go to university pathway into this industry, or are there other options? Is micro credentials, many of the things that both Bryce and Izzy have just spoken of, are they options that will make you employable? What do you think?
Oh, well, I've got a degree in philosophy, not in science.
Case in point, then.
Yeah, so I'd argue very strongly that a BSc in computer science is completely inessential. Might be useful. I think, look, when you've got the massive demand and the undersupply of people, then there's opportunities for people who are interested and motivated. And that means you can, there's a bunch of areas in IT where kind of self-training is not going to quite cut it. But this is absolutely one that, if you're showing willingness, if you're showing the drive to go off and do some self-study and show that you've understood this stuff, then a lot more people will take a punt on you because they kind of have to. And that's, and there's a bunch of resources. I would also point out that if you're a library subscriber, you can get access to LinkedIn Learning, and that has huge amounts of training around cybersecurity, for example. So use your local library. There's so many of those resources, and just showing initiative and willingness, that's kind of half the battle. So that would definitely be my suggestion.
Right.
Yeah. You don't need to have the degree.
Thank you. And that's really good to know. There's a piece of work on reskilling and upskilling that's coming out of the Digital Industry Transformation Plan, and cyber has definitely got a big piece of that puzzle. And different pathways, different ways of learning, micro credentials bundled together are all on the table now. Learning is really in the hands of the learner rather than the hands of the institutes. Now we've got lots more questions in 4 minutes, so I'm going to quick fire a couple of questions at you all. The very first question that we had was from Gareth was, what role do you think digital poverty plays in the cybersecurity maturity of New Zealand? I know that's a complex question. We could discuss that for an hour in itself, but really short, concise answers if that's okay. Doug, do you have a view on that?
Well, look. The big thing that I'm keen on is getting more Pacifica and Maori into cybersecurity. Again, you know, I've lived and worked in the Pacific. There's lots of talented people, but we're failing here in New Zealand. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, other than you know, from a personal perspective, encouraging people. But that's one of the things that I think is a real issue.
And that's a digital technology and digital poverty, digital equity question generally. Izzy, what's your thought on this question?
Yeah, I think absolutely the equity issue, it applies to everything in IT across the board. I think security is one of those. Just for instance, you know, if you've got an old device that you can't patch anymore, you're inherently going to be less secure. So I think that it's something that we need to be mindful of, and also we need to be thinking about how we can encourage things like retailers to be ensuring that just because something is at a lower price point, that it's not less secure, and how we can use levers to ensure that that happens.
Great answer. Now, Bryce, new quickfire question. We had an early question from Paul around government versus private enterprises responsibilities. Where do they begin and end? And then he asked a great question of, do we need more GDPR-like legislation in New Zealand to help solve this cyber capability, cyber maturity challenge? We've had Doug's view on that. What's your view on legislating on this, Bryce?
Education, then legislate. There you go, short and sweet.
In that order?
Yeah,
absolutely. Izzy, you spent 6 years at the CERT. What's your thoughts on that, on legislation and the role?
Yeah, I think that when you've got things in your back pocket that make your job easier, that's always a good thing. And so if you're trying to encourage someone to do something, having both a carrot and a stick is always useful.
Excellent. And then really quickly, I'm going to ask you for just kind of your last words. You've all given us some great tips already. B. Williams asked the question of how people often look at cybersecurity in a one-off kind of, or their security in a one-off basis, and then view it with some level of dismay. If there's one thing that you wanted the listeners of this webinar to go away with today, what would that one piece of advice be? Doug, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm building on Bryce's point earlier about resilience, right? For me, there's so much going on, there's so much crime, there's so many opportunities. I think you should assume that you're going to get breached, or that you have already been breached, and work on incident response. Excellent.
Bryce, what's the one thing you'd like people to go away from this with?
If you want to break in, if you want to learn, if you're suffering from digital poverty, Linux.
I love your answer.
Yep,
but
Linux.
That's been my DNA.
Yeah,
I worked on a Linux kernel at the beginning of my career.
Yep, I started with Slackware.
Izzy, what's your one thing you'd like people to take away?
Yeah, I think my one thing, just to hark back to awareness, since it's my bread and butter, is don't think about the people you're talking to as an amorphous blob. You know, we all come to this as individuals, and the more that we can individualize the advice that we give people, the better resonance it's going to have with them, and the more secure they'll be.
Thank you all so much. Thank you everyone who is listening. We have 11 other questions that we didn't answer, so I'm going to take it on myself to email you all with those questions and get some answers, and we'll put them up on Tech Blog, on the ITP blog site. Really appreciate your time and insights, and I hope this is just the beginning of a series of webinars where we can distill down into some of these big issues, and I'd love to have you all back again. So ngā mihi nui to everyone on the call, ka kite, and have a great evening everyone.